Hello, my name is Christine Cray. The title of my paper is Straddling a Border on the Colonial Construction of Indigenous Illegality. In the modern geopolitical imagination, borders are typically crossed unidirectionally. Nation-states define and fortify borders, individuals properly belong to one side, and those who do cross do so in one direction, seeking to gain something on the other side. Less well understood, however, are the processes that generate trans-border living, or straddling a border, in which people routinely cross borders. Such border hoppers are cast as illegal, or at the very least transgressive and suspect, tainted by their rootlessness. However, the politico-economic conditions that generate such straddling of borders are critical to understand if just and humane policies, including those of Indigenous land rights, are to be fashioned. This paper traces the colonial construction of Indigenous illegality in the borderlands between Mexico and British Honduras in the late 19th century. Several factors rooted in European imperialism created the conditions in which Indigenous Maya people had the best chances of physical survival, making a livelihood, evading debt, and remaining free of bondage if they routinely crossed the presumed border marked by the Hondo River. This creative strategy of trans-border living, however, earned them the opprobrium and suspicion of British Honduran officials and employers and cemented the misperception of them as immigrants, thus setting them up for subsequent exclusion from collective land rights. In the Westphalian international system, we tend to think of the world as divided into territorially bounded nation-states into which individuals are sorted. Citizens have homelands in which they belong, and those who cross the border are out of place, aliens, unless and until they submit to a process of legalization. This geopolitical model rests upon an assumption that the default position is fixed settlement rather than mobility. This model is extended to indigenous people within settler colonies. The general expectation is that they have a fixed homeland from time immemorial. Consequently, when it comes to indigenous land claims, the only question is that of determining the boundaries of that fixed homeland. However, what if these baseline assumptions are wrong? What if, historically, mobility is just as common as fixed settlement? More to the point, what if borders, or lines separating imagined political spheres, actually trigger cross-border movement? Political borders, their qualities, and the patterns and frequencies of cross-border movement are all variables that change over time. The differential distribution of goods and regulatory schemes on either side of a border sets up imbalances that stimulate cross-border flows. I use the term trans-border living to refer to patterns of frequently crossing a border in both directions when movement across an imagined border becomes part of one's routine habits and comprehensive strategy for living. The supposed border between the newly imagined colony of British Honduras and the newly independent nation of Mexico in the 19th century serves as an excellent example of how the creation of a border stimulated cross-border flow and ultimately created a category of indigenous immigrants. This audience knows that British settlement in the region was initially motivated by timber extraction. Treaties in 1763, 1783, and 1786 conferred upon England the right to extract timber in the region upon certain lands claimed by Spain. When the British defeated the Spanish at the Battle of St. George's Caye in 1798, that convinced British officials of their sovereign dominion, and they claimed the Hondo River as the northern border of what they came to call the colony of British Honduras. For the Indigenous Maya people of the region, of course, the Hondo River posed no barrier to their movements. Since the pre-Hispanic period, the region was routinely traversed by traders and farmers in search of new garden plots, among others. In the 16th century, when Spanish colonists raided indigenous settlements and established exploitative patterns of forced labor, tribute, and resettlement, primarily in the northern half of the peninsula, thousands of Maya fled these depredations, seeking refuge south of the river, where the Spaniards had very little control. These were long-standing patterns of movement across the Hondo River, but that line was not yet considered a border between polities, not really until the late 19th century. At that time, under the aforementioned treaties, British loggers were granted use rights to extract timber, first logwood and later mahogany, from the area between the Hondo and Belize rivers, thereby establishing the Hondo River as the imagined northern limit of the British settlement. Enslaved Africans and African-descended people were the primary workers on the logging crews, and in a pattern identified by Matthew Restall, these enslaved people frequently fled across the limits of the British use rights region in order, they thought, to escape bondage and find freedom. Such patterns of flight rested upon a recognition of certain limits as delineating Spanish versus British territory. The cross-border flight of enslaved people, in other words, served to define the borders as real. The borders consequently existed not only in the minds of British colonialists, but also in the minds of escaped slaves who acted with reference to those imagined borders. The borders became real as people adjusted their strategies in relationship to them. At the same time, in the late 18th century and through the mid-19th century, in the northern part of the peninsula, regimes of taxation and the alienation of communal indigenous lands facilitated the proliferation and expansion of large-scale commercial plantations. Thousands of Maya workers became trapped as indebted servants, but many escaped southward into the region increasingly plied by British loggers. Here again, flight across the Hondo presupposed a boundary separating Spanish, and later Mexican, territory from British territory. Once again, flight motivated by the desire to find freedom within a new polity helped bring into existence a spatial division between territories. The patterns of cross-border movement discussed thus far, enslaved people fleeing northward and indebted peons fleeing southward, were unidirectional. The emergence of regular trans-border movement, frequent movement back and forth across a line, began in the mid-19th century, triggered by the social war of Yucatan, more commonly known as the Caste War. In violation of prior Anglo-Spanish treaties, British merchants sold copious amounts of guns and gunpowder to the Maya rebels while purchasing mahogany timber from them and shipping it to markets in the US and Britain. Mahogany became a primary source of war financing for two groups of armed Maya fighters, the Cruzab rebels and the Pacificos, who brokered peace with the Yucatecan government in 1853. Individual logging crews routinely extracted timber from both sides of the Hondo River, which was efficient, but in violation of British and Mexican territorial claims. Guns and gunpowder were also transported by canoe up the Hondo River. The river, therefore, became a conduit of illicit trade. Both Yucatecan and British officials began inspecting canoes moving along the river, which was the first manifestation of border securitization. Beginning in 1848, thousands of Yucatecans of both Maya and Spanish descent fled the violence to the north and resettled south of the Hondo River, where they expected to be safe in British-claimed territory. In the meantime, most of the northern British Honduran region was claimed as private property by a very small number of timber companies, most notably the British Honduras Company, later known as the Belize Estate and Produce Company. In the absence of open land upon which they could settle, the Maya from the north ended up as tenants on British-owned land, paying rent and providing the workforce for landowners, including those who were keen to take advantage of their knowledge of sugarcane and rum production. In a short period of time, Yucatecan patterns of trapping laborers in cycles of debt were adopted by British Honduran landowners and timber companies. Consequently, those crossing the Hondo River hoping to find freedom would again become trapped in debt servitude on the other side of the river. But perhaps they could cross the river once again and keep up this cycle of debt and flight across the river indefinitely. Those best able to preserve their freedom were those who could manage to farm their own garden plots and who kept their expenses to a minimum. In the era of land monopolization, though, where were they to find open farmland? North of the river, the two armed Maya forces offered Maya settlers the right to farm on land the soldiers had secured in battle, but with the proviso that they submit to a military draft and pay rent. Under these conditions, remaining solely on one side of the river was a sure path to debt servitude, military raids, forced military service, or all three. Consequently, in 1860s, a new pattern of trans-border living emerged in which many Maya farmed to the north of the Hondo River on lands claimed by one of the armed Maya groups, but they erected their houses south of the river. By doing so, they aimed to evade the obligatory military service and paying rent on their garden plots. This strategy was risky because Maya soldiers would cross the river to capture those whom they considered deserters and absconded debtors. Moreover, the Maya residents still had to pay British landowners rent for their house lots. However, when finding themselves in a jam on one side, they could cross to the other and hopefully start with a clean balance sheet. In the 1860s, consequently, a series of new Maya settlements sprang up on the banks all along the river, settled by these border hoppers, people who found trans-border living to be their best chance of survival and freedom. In 1868, when the British Honduran government formed a frontier police, naturally they were concerned with the cross-border movement of armed fighters and munitions. Of equal concern to them were these trans-border residents whose presence as debt absconders and deserters attracted raids by Maya fighters. In a curious twist of fate, then, to forestall Maya raids into presumed British territory, the chief of the frontier police began collecting rent in villages on the southern banks from people who were said to owe it to the Maya armed groups whose lands they farmed to the north of the river. The Maya who lived along and routinely crossed the Hondo River obviously pursued a creative strategy of survival, taking full advantage of the fact that different polities claimed the right to regulate affairs on opposite sides of the river. Their trans-border pattern of residence and mobility presupposed this spatial political division, and the concentration of houses along the river constituted a material manifestation of that border. Routine and strategic crossing of this line in one direction and then the other, therefore, both presupposed and instantiated a boundary between two territorially distinctive policies. In sum, the border and transborder living were mutually constitutive. For the Maya, though, this pattern of transborder living had regrettable long-term consequences. Among the British, the Maya people living in villages along the river gained a reputation as both disloyal and a nuisance. In addition, in those riverine villages clustered people involved in a variety of illicit and shadowy activities: munition sales, armed rebellion, smuggling, escape from imprisonment, unlicensed rum production, and timber theft, in addition to desertion and dodging debt service. Notions of illegality compounded notions of disloyalty and nuisance. Despite long-standing patterns of settlement and mobility throughout the region, the Yucatec Maya in British Honduras were cast as immigrants. Characterized thusly, they generally have been unable to make a successful bid for collective lands as indigenous people. The creation of a territorially based colony, therefore, transformed indigenous residents into a suspect immigrant group, not directly, but indirectly through generating the conditions that triggered transborder living. Thank you very much.